Someone is investigating you. David squeezed a cigarette in his hand, thought for a while, and then put it down. Grace has already told me about Bessie. Don't worry, I've already sent someone to arrange it. Grandma Bertha was from the countryside and was not very cultured. She felt helpless and anxious about being part of such a rich family for the first time. Even if David's attitude towards her was good, she still felt slightly uncomfortable. He would occasionally make conversations with Bertha to ease her awkwardness while awaiting for Grace to come back. Bessie is casually leaning on the sofa and was playing a game on her mobile phone. Thomas could see her long eyelashes fluttering slightly through his angle. She seemed to notice him peeping at her and slowly raised her head. She was more relaxed and peaceful as compared to Bertha. Thomas's hand that held the teacup paused for a moment. He wasn't embarrassed to be caught in the act and just smiled distantly. Bessie looked away and calmly changed her posture. She continued to play on her phone. Thomas, who'd never been given the cold shoulder, was stunned once again. After a short while, he reacted and turned his brightly lit screen off. Then he leaned back and sneered. He had a frivolous expression on his cultured and refined face. Sure enough, as his dad described, she was a troublemaker. She was quite arrogant, he thought. Grandma Bertha knew that Bessie loved to play games when she was bored. It wasn't that she didn't want to control Bessie, but every time she looked at her with her pair of beautiful almond eyes, the bottom of her eyes would turn misty. Who could stand it? Grandma Bertha would then forget about her anger. Even if she played while bunking her class, Bertha would still turn a blind eye on it. She really adored the kid. But now, Bessie had already been expelled for a year, and Bertha had also found out about her illness. So this time, she ruthlessly ignored Bessie and her behavior. No matter what method she used, Bertha made up her mind to send her to a school in Chicago. David, the patriarch of the Smith family, was right in front of her. Bertha wanted Bessie to make a good impression on him. She had reminded Bessie more than once to stop playing her games and to behave in front of David. Bertha was worried. Who would take care of her after she was gone? Everyone in the room was in their own thoughts and didn't talk much until Grace came back with Anne. The atmosphere suddenly eased. David looked at Anne, who was following Grace obediently, and smiled with affection. Aunt Ruth, who had been cold to Bessie and Bertha, rushed to greet them and took the school bag from Anne's hands. She greeted them respectfully. "Madame, Miss." Everyone on the sofa, including David, stood up. Under Bertha's stare, Bessie reluctantly got up too. She leaned against the sofa and stared coldly at Anne and Grace. She looked arrogant. She gave them a glance before going back to staring at her phone. She wasn't playing games anymore and seemed to be chatting with someone. Bessie's accomplishments were already incredibly inferior compared to ordinary people, let alone to the outstanding Thomas. The thought of this was quite irritating to Grace. How could Grace have the face to talk about Bessie in front of the Smith family's heir, Thomas? Wouldn't it be a joke to mention her? So she kept talking to Grandma Bertha and David without mentioning Bessie. Anne was rehearsing for middle school's recital, so she came back late. Talking about Anne, Grace was flushed with excitement. The smile on her face faded a little. After Anne returned, she walked directly to Thomas. She held his arm and smiled at him. "Brother, why are you back?" "I have a project." Thomas narrowed his eyes. Anne was the only girl in the Smith family, so everyone adored her, including Thomas. While talking, he glanced at Bessie, who had one hand in her pocket and the other holding her mobile phone while leaning casually against the sofa. She was looking down, so it was hard to tell. Anne saw Thomas's strange expression and tilted her head. On the way back, Grace had informed Anne beforehand, so she knew that Bessie was here. She stared at Bessie for a moment and then glanced back. The nanny soon set the dinner. While eating, David glanced at Bessie. After thinking for a while, he said in a calm tone, "Let her go to First Middle School. She and Anne can take care of each other." After David said this, the atmosphere at the dinner table changed. Anne paused. She glanced at Bessie and looked indifferent. "First Middle School? Same class as me?" because Bessie was 1 year older than Anne and thought Bessie was here to attend college. Even Aunt Ruth, who stood at the side, also glanced mockingly at Bessie. Then she quickly lowered her head. Grace's face was a bit stiff. She had never felt so shameful after being a part of the Smith family for so many years. But David's expression was the same. He said in a mild tone, "Your sister has to repeat her 3rd year due to some issues. Her grades couldn't possibly be good if she had to repeat her 3rd year." "Oh, I see." Anne smiled and nodded and stayed silent after that. Everyone in the Smith family knew that Anne had been among the top 5 students in her class. Grace intended for Bessie to be put into a private school and hadn't expected David to let Bessie go to First Middle School. Everyone knew that that school was the best one in Chicago. To put a person like Bessie with such a bad record and grades into First Middle School, David had to spend a lot of time and owe the principal a favor. They only had top students. A student like Bessie would be unusual. But it isn't easy to get into First Middle School. Grace knew this. She felt depressed and immediately lost her appetite. She paused and thought of something. "Bessie, I remember you were enrolled in a violin class when you were young. What level are you at now?" First Middle School had art class. Bessie lowered her head and gnawed on a piece of rib. She was absent-minded and didn't even look up. Grace was about to flare up when David glanced over. She suppressed her anger and repeated her words with a cold face. Bessie's sitting posture was unruly. She raised her legs, held her fork in one hand, and popped her arm on the table. She looked like a tomboy, proud and rebellious. As if she only heard the voice now, Bessie looked up. At the mention of Bessie having learned violin before, Thomas looked up at her. He heard Bessie say, "Violin?" and suddenly smiled. Her voice was dull and cold. "Oh, I don't know how to play." "You don't? How come? You started learning it when you were young." Grace questioned and gritted her teeth. "I paid for your violin classes every year. Mr. Williams even said you had a good talent." "Oh." Bessie was fiddling with the rib. "Ever since I hit Mr. Robinson Williams' son's head, I haven't seen him." There was a strange silence at the dining table. Bessie laughed awkwardly. Her slightly raised eyebrows made her look arrogant and a bit ruthless. In Grace's words, she was a bandit. Both bandit and wild, seemingly gorgeous and alluring, but untouchable. Grace glanced at her, eyes flushed slightly. "Bessie." Grace remembered that Bessie had learned the violin when she was young. Since she wasn't good at studying, she could just change her path and take on arts. She didn't expect Bessie to take the initiative. David had seen Bessie's record in the afternoon. He knew she was a troublemaker, but didn't expect her to be so full of thorns. Aunt Ruth brought a cup of tea for Grace. Grace sighed, drank it, and stopped mentioning the matter. But her tight back showed that she wasn't in a good mood. David was busy with his business and naturally didn't have the spare time to spend around Grandma Bertha and Bessie. Or maybe he thought it wasn't necessary. After dinner, they all dispersed. When Anne obediently told Grace she was going upstairs to play the violin, Grace looked at her younger daughter and her older daughter. Both were obviously her children, but how could the difference between them be so big? "Go stay with your grandmother on the 3rd floor for the time being. I'll let Aunt Ruth clean up another room for you later." Grace frowned and tilted her head slightly. She suppressed the anger in her heart and lowered her voice. "Other than the bathroom, the 2nd floor has your sister's piano room. Don't bother her over nothing." As soon as Anne left, the tenderness on her face faded. Bessie leaned on the staircase and nodded her head indifferently. Since Bessie's attitude was fairly obedient, Grace's sullen expression finally eased. After all, she was her daughter and she still had feelings for her. Grace said a few things to Grandma Bertha before turning around to see that Bessie had her phone out again. She frowned and was about to nag at her, but it just so happened that the piano room on the 2nd floor wasn't fully closed, and the melodious and gentle violin sound floated out. Grace was relieved and said to Aunt Ruth, "It seems that Anne will go to 10th grade soon. Bessie, learn from your sister more. There should be a beginning and an end to everything." Her words turned to Bessie again. Bessie stared at the 2nd floor, rolling her eyes. She turned and went upstairs, ignoring Grace. Grace pointed at her back with a flushed face. She thought about just how Bessie had slammed a brick again and again on her head. Grandma Bertha frowned, but was reluctant to fault Bessie, so she could only calm Grace down. Upstairs, the nanny had already taken Grandma Bertha's things to the next room. Bessie took a bath and, before her hair was completely dry, she tied the straps of her bathrobe while reaching out for the new-looking computer from her backpack. Next to the computer was a heavy mobile phone, which looked different from the mobile phone she usually played games on. She didn't look at the phone, just pressed her towel on her head and placed the computer on the table. As soon as she opened the computer, the desktop screen appeared. The computer desktop was empty, except for the desert background. There was only a white mouse arrow and no other icon could be seen. It was a very warm yet oppressive desert color. Bessie pressed a few keys, then got up and poured a glass of water. She sat on the chair with a glass of water and a face appeared on the computer screen. The other person was wearing a white shirt, holding a cell phone in one hand and a medicine box in the other. With a white shirt on, sculpted eyebrows, perfect skin, he looked quite handsome. "Someone is investigating you." Bessie leaned on the back of the chair and took a sip of water. "Someone from Evanston. I've sent you the information." Who was this person and why would they investigate a small-town teenage girl? At the age of 6, Bessie already knew that she was different from the others after finishing her elementary school course. She couldn't play with her peers and would occasionally have episodes. Her neighbors all thought she was crazy and avoided her. Grace and Anne only focused on quarreling every day and didn't pay much attention to her situation. They only knew that she loved to fight, had a mental problem, and didn't want to go to school. Both of her parents weren't willing to take her after the divorce. Bessie taught herself high school content at the age of 8. At the age of 9, she assembled the first computer and used her own code to break into a hacker website. Will Mrs. Smith ever appreciate or acknowledge Bessie's talents or her presence? Will Bessie continue to hide her reality and endure more pain and insults during her stay at the mansion?